Old comrades laugh at single dad at military reunion, unaware he's their hero commander. The banquet hall went silent the moment General Marcus Whitfield stood up. Tom Reyes was still holding his water glass, halfway through pretending he hadn't heard the laughter 3 tables over. His daughter's photo was tucked in his breast pocket, the way it always was at these things, like a reminder of why he'd come at all. He hadn't wanted to. He'd told himself 100 times on the drive over that this reunion didn't matter, that these men in their pressed blazers with their loud stories didn't matter. But here he was anyway, sitting alone, wearing a jacket that didn't quite fit anymore, listening to Randall Cobb do an impression of him that wasn't kind. Reyes here probably still thinks a forklift is heavy machinery, Randall said, and the table around him erupted. Tom didn't look up. He'd learned a long time ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, especially not this one, not tonight, not in front of people who'd already decided who he was. Then General Whitfield's chair scraped back. The old man's eyes were fixed across the room, and his hand was trembling slightly as he set down his own glass. He wasn't looking at Randall. He wasn't looking at the buffet table or the little American flags stuck in the centerpieces. He was looking directly at Tom Reyes, and something in his face had gone pale, like he'd seen a ghost stand up from the dead. "Colonel," the general said, his voice cracking through the hall like a rifle shot. "Colonel Reyes." The laughter died so fast it was like someone had cut the sound. Every head in that banquet hall turned toward the quiet man in the ill-fitting jacket, the one who'd spent the whole evening being mocked, the one nobody had bothered to ask a single real question. And General Whitfield, a man who had commanded thousands, who did not stand for anyone, was already walking toward him with his hand extended and something like reverence in his eyes. Randall Cobb's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Nobody in that room understood yet what was happening. But they were about to. 3 weeks earlier, none of this had started. Tom Reyes was just a man trying to get his daughter to school on time. Tom Reyes lived in a small 2-bedroom rental on the edge of Ashford Falls, the kind of town where everybody knew everybody, or thought they did. He worked mornings at the hardware store on 5th Street, restocking shelves and helping old Mrs. Kellerman find the right size of pipe fitting. In the afternoons, he picked up his daughter Lily from school, and most nights, after she was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table doing paperwork nobody ever asked to see. He was 44 years old. He had a quiet way of moving through a room, like he was used to taking up less space than he needed. His hands were rough, his shoulders slightly stooped, and he wore the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation because buying new clothes felt like a luxury he couldn't justify when Lily needed new soccer cleats. Nobody in Ashford Falls knew much about Tom's life before he showed up 4 years ago. They knew his wife had passed cancer, quick and cruel, and that he'd moved here with a 6-year-old and a U-Haul and not much else. They knew he kept to himself. They knew he didn't talk about the military service listed briefly on the intake form at Lily's school, the one that just said veteran in a checkbox nobody followed up on. What they didn't know was who he used to be. Tom never brought it up. Not because he was ashamed, but because that part of his life belonged to people who were gone now, to men who hadn't made it home, and talking about it felt like it cheapened something sacred. So when people assumed he'd been a supply clerk, or a mechanic, or nothing much at all, he let them assume it. It was easier that way. It hurt less. The invitation to the reunion had come in the mail 2 months earlier, forwarded 3 times before it found him. The 3rd Battalion, 9th Infantry Regiment 20-year reunion, it read, along with a date, a hotel ballroom in the city an hour away, and a request for an RSVP. Tom had almost thrown it away. He'd stared at it on the kitchen counter for 2 weeks before Lily asked him about it. "What's that, Dad?" "Just some old work friends," he'd said. "Having a party. Are you gonna go?" He hadn't answered right away. Lily was 8 now, old enough to notice when her father got quiet in a certain way, the way that meant he was somewhere else in his head. She didn't push. She never did. She just climbed into the chair next to him and put her small hand on his arm, the same gesture her mother used to make, and something about that decided it for him. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think I will." He told himself it would be good to see some familiar faces. He told himself it had been long enough. What he didn't tell himself, because he didn't fully believe it yet, was that some part of him wanted to know if anyone still remembered. The reunion was being organized by a man named Randall Cobb, who Tom vaguely recalled from 2 decades ago as a logistics sergeant with a talent for complaining and an even bigger talent for taking credit. Randall had built a modestly successful insurance agency since leaving the service, and he liked to remind everyone of that fact early and often. He'd rented out the ballroom at the Continental Hotel, hired a small band, and printed name tags with everyone's old rank and unit. When Tom arrived, name tag reading simply T. Reyes, Randall looked him up and down like he was trying to place a stray dog that had wandered into a wedding. "Reyes," Randall said slowly. "Reyes. Didn't you push crates around at the depot?" "Something like that," Tom said. It wasn't a lie, exactly. It also wasn't the truth. But Tom had learned that correcting people rarely went the way he hoped, so he let it slide, took his name tag, and found a seat near the back where he could watch the room without being watched. The years had been kind to some of the men in that ballroom and less kind to others, but nearly all of them had one thing in common: a way of carrying themselves like they still had something to prove. There was Randall, working the room in a blazer a size too tight, laughing loudest at his own jokes. There was Denny Voss, a car dealership owner who kept steering conversations toward how much his houses were worth. There was a cluster of men near the bar reliving old stories, most of which had grown taller with each retelling. And then there was Private Ellis Boone. Ellis had been the youngest man in the unit back in the day, barely 19 when he'd enlisted, a nervous kid from rural Georgia who used to stutter when he was scared. 20 years later, he still had that same soft, uncertain way about him, sitting near the edge of the room in a second-hand suit, clearly out of place among the insurance agents and car dealers and men who'd built comfortable lives. Tom remembered Ellis. Not well, not personally, but he remembered him the way you remember someone who needed protecting. Randall found his way to Tom's table around the second hour, drink in hand, several old comrades trailing behind him like an entourage. "So what VE you been up to, Reyes?" Randall asked, not quite looking at him, already halfway distracted by something across the room. "Still working with your hands somewhere?" "Hardware store," Tom said. "Ashford Falls." Randall snorted, a short, ugly little sound. "Hardware store. Well, somebody's gotta stock the shelves, right?" The men around him laughed, not cruelly exactly, more the careless kind of laughter that comes from people who've never had to think twice about how their words land. Tom didn't respond. He picked up his water glass and took a slow sip, the way he'd learned to do a long time ago when silence was the only weapon worth using. "You remember Reyes," Randall said to the group, louder now, performing for an audience. "Quiet guy. Kept to himself. I always figured he'd end up doing something simple. No offense, man. Some guys just aren't built for the spotlight." "None taken," Tom said quietly. But across the table, he noticed Ellis Boone watching the exchange with something like discomfort, like he wanted to say something and didn't have the nerve. The evening rolled on that way, small cut after small cut, the kind of casual disrespect that doesn't leave a mark you can point to, just a slow accumulation of being made to feel smaller than you are. Denny Voss asked Tom, with mock sincerity, if he'd ever thought about getting into something with more of a future. A man named Petroselli asked if Tom's daughter's school had good after-school programs, since I'm guessing money's tight. Someone made a joke about Tom's flannel shirt that wasn't really about the shirt at all. None of it was said with real venom. That was almost the worst part. It was said the way people say things when they've already decided you don't matter enough to hurt on purpose, the casual cruelty of people who think they're better than you and don't even have to try. Tom absorbed it the way he absorbed most things, quietly, patiently, filing it away without letting it show on his face. But he noticed things too. He noticed the tremor in Randall's hand every time he refilled his drink, the kind of tremor that spoke of old anxieties dressed up in expensive cologne. He noticed how Denny Voss kept glancing toward the door like he was checking to see who else important might walk in. He noticed how nobody at that reunion had asked a single real question about anyone else's life, not about struggles, not about losses, not about the wife Tom had buried 4 years ago or the daughter he was raising alone. They asked about jobs and cars and houses, the surface things, because the surface things were safe. And he noticed Ellis Boone, sitting quietly at the edge of every conversation, being talked over and around like he was furniture. Around 9 o'clock, the real incident happened, the one that would later feel, in hindsight, like the moment the whole evening tipped. Ellis had been trying to tell a story. It wasn't a dramatic story, just something about a training exercise from years ago, something that had clearly meant something to him, some small moment of connection he'd carried with him all this time. But halfway through, Randall cut him off mid-sentence to make a joke about Ellis's stutter, the one that used to show up when he was nervous. Sorry, Al, what was that?" Randall said, grinning, doing the impression badly and loudly enough for half the room to hear. The table laughed. Ellis's face went red. He didn't finish the story. He just looked down at his plate and got very quiet, the way people get quiet when they've decided it's safer not to take up space anymore. Tom felt something shift in his chest, something he hadn't felt in a long time, not exactly anger, more like recognition. He knew that particular kind of quiet. He'd seen it in soldiers who'd stopped believing anyone would have their back. He'd spent years making sure his own men never had to feel that way. He leaned over toward Ellis, quiet enough that only the two of them could hear. "You were saying something about the obstacle course at Benning," Tom said. "The one with the rope bridge that always flooded." Ellis blinked up at him, startled that anyone had actually been listening. "Yeah," he said slowly. "Yeah, you remember that?" "I remember," Tom said. "Go on. I want to hear the rest." And so, quietly, just between the two of them while the rest of the table moved on to some other conversation, Ellis finished his story. It wasn't much of a story, really, nothing that would have impressed anyone at that table. But Ellis told it with a kind of relief in his voice, like someone had finally handed him back something that had been taken from him a long time ago. Tom listened to every word. It was a small moment. Nobody else in the room noticed it happen. But it was the first genuine exchange of the whole evening, and it planted something in Tom that hadn't been there before, not anger exactly, but resolve. Throughout the night, there were other things too, small details that most people wouldn't have caught. When Randall made a comment about the guys who actually ran things back then, his eyes flicked, just briefly, toward Tom, then away, like some old instinct told him not to look too long. When Denny Voss mentioned the colonel in passing, talking about someone who'd apparently commanded their battalion decades ago, a man named Whitfield who'd since become a general, several of the older attendees went quiet with something like respect. Nobody connected that reverence to the man in the flannel shirt sitting near the back. There was a framed photo on a display table near the entrance, an old unit photo from deployment, rows of young men in uniform standing in formation. Tom had walked past it earlier and paused, just for a second, his eyes finding a face in the front row that nobody else seemed to recognize as belonging to anyone still in that room. Nobody noticed that either. Around 10, Randall stood up to give a toast, tapping his glass with a fork until the room quieted. 20 years, he said, raising his glass. 20 years since we all served together. Some of us went on to do great things. He gestured vaguely around the room, a self-congratulatory sweep of his arm. Built businesses. Built families. Made something of ourselves. His eyes drifted, almost involuntarily, toward Tom's table. And some of us, well, I guess we all end up where we end up, right? A few people laughed, uncomfortable laughter this time, the kind that comes when a joke has curdled slightly but nobody wants to be the one to say so. Tom raised his glass along with everyone else and said nothing. But something in the room had shifted, and it wasn't just in Tom. Ellis Boone was watching Randall with an expression that had hardened somewhere between the stutter joke and this toast. And near the doorway, unnoticed by almost everyone, an older man in a well-tailored gray suit had just walked in, flanked by two younger men in uniform, and was scanning the room with the sharp, searching eyes of someone looking for one particular face. It was General Marcus Whitfield. He'd been invited as a guest of honor, a formality more than anything, the kind of appearance retired generals sometimes made at these events, shaking hands, posing for photos, reminding everyone of the chain of command they used to belong to. Randall had spent weeks bragging about securing his attendance. Whitfield's eyes moved across the room, past the insurance agents and car dealers, past Randall mid-toast, and stopped. They stopped on Tom. For a long moment, the general didn't move. He just stood in the doorway, staring at a man in a worn flannel shirt sitting quietly near the back of the room, and something in his weathered face began to change, disbelief giving way slowly to certainty. "That's not possible," he murmured to the aide beside him. "Sir?" Whitfield didn't answer. He was already walking forward, cutting straight through the middle of the room, past Randall's toast, past the tables of laughing men who had no idea what was about to happen. Randall, mid-sentence, faltered as he noticed the general approaching, then brightened, assuming the attention was for him. "General Whitfield," he said, extending a hand, "so glad you could make it, we were just—" Whitfield walked past him without a glance. He stopped in front of Tom's table, and the room, sensing something was happening even if they didn't understand what, began to quiet. "Colonel Reyes," Whitfield said, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man not used to being surprised. "I thought you were dead." The silence that followed was total. Tom stood up slowly, and for the first time all evening, something in his posture changed, not dramatically, but unmistakably. The stoop in his shoulders straightened. The quiet, careful way he'd been holding himself all night fell away, replaced by something that looked, for just a moment, like the bearing of a much younger man who used to command rooms far more dangerous than this one. "Not dead, sir," Tom said. "Just retired further than most people know." Whitfield reached out and gripped Tom's hand with both of his own, and there were, unmistakably, tears in the old general's eyes. 8 years, Whitfield said, his voice rough. 8 years I've wondered what happened to you after Kandahar. After the extraction. I put in a commendation that never got answered. I tried to find you at the hospital and you'd already discharged yourself and vanished. Half the division thought you'd died from those injuries. The other half thought you just walked away from all of it. I walked away, Tom said quietly. Wasn't ready to be a symbol. Needed to be a father instead. Randall Cobb, still standing a few feet away with his toast forgotten and his glass slowly lowering, looked like a man watching his understanding of reality dissolve in real time. "Colonel," he repeated, the word catching strangely in his throat. "Wait. Reyes was you're saying he commanded the 3rd Battalion for the last 2 years of our deployment," Whitfield said, turning to address the room, his voice carrying now with the natural authority of a man who'd spent 35 years giving orders. "Colonel Thomas Reyes led the extraction at Kandahar Ridge that saved 41 men, including 3 men in this room tonight. He took 2 rounds doing it. He refused every medal ceremony afterward. He requested his own discharge be processed quietly, no press, no fanfare, because he said the men who didn't make it home deserved the attention more than he did." The room had gone utterly, completely silent. Denny Voss had gone pale. Petroselli's mouth was slightly open. Somewhere near the back, one of the older attendees, a man Tom vaguely remembered as a young private from years ago, had put a hand over his own mouth. "You said he pushed crates at a depot," someone murmured to Randall, who had no answer. Whitfield turned back to Tom, his hand still resting on the younger man's shoulder. "I've spent 8 years trying to track you down, Colonel. There's a memorial wall at the base with your name misspelled because nobody could confirm you were alive to correct it. There are 41 families who've been trying to say thank you to a ghost." Tom's jaw tightened, and for a moment, something raw flickered across his face, grief, maybe, or the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent years running from his own significance. "I wasn't running from gratitude, sir," he said quietly. "I was running from the weight of it. Every time someone said my name back then, they were really saying the names of the men who didn't make it home with me. I couldn't carry that and raise a little girl at the same time. So I chose her." Nobody in the room said anything for a long moment. It was Ellis Boone who finally broke the silence, standing up slowly from his seat, his voice steadier than it had been all evening. "He listened to me tonight," Ellis said, "to no one in particular, to everyone. When nobody else would. Even not knowing any of this. He just listened." Randall Cobb sat down heavily in his chair, his face the color of old paper, the insurance agency confidence completely drained out of him. "I made fun of you," he said, almost to himself, staring at Tom like he was seeing him for the first time. "All night. I made fun of you." "You did," Tom said. There was no cruelty in his voice. There wasn't even much anger left in it, just a kind of tired honesty. You've been doing it for 20 years, actually. Different version of the same thing. Back then it was because I was quiet and didn't brag about rank. Tonight it was because you decided a man in a hardware store apron wasn't worth your respect. Randall opened his mouth, then closed it again, apparently unable to find words equal to the moment. Denny Voss, to his credit, stood up and walked over, his expression somewhere between shame and disbelief. Colonel, sir, I had no idea. If I'd known, that's exactly the problem, Tom said, not unkindly, but firmly. You shouldn't have needed to know who I used to be in order to treat me like I mattered tonight. The words landed heavy in the room, heavier than any revelation about rank or medals could have. Several men looked away, unable to hold his gaze. It wasn't the shock of learning Tom's history that stung the most, it was the sudden, undeniable realization of how easily they'd decided a quiet man in a flannel shirt didn't deserve basic decency. General Whitfield cleared his throat, addressing the room now with the tone of a man restoring order. I think, he said, we owe Colonel Reyes an evening that actually honors what he did instead of one that mocked what we assumed he didn't do. There was a murmur of agreement, sudden and slightly desperate, from around the room. Randall stood up again, his earlier bravado replaced by something much smaller. Colonel Reyes, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I am genuinely, deeply sorry. Tonight and every reunion before it. I built my whole identity around being the guy in charge of this group, and somewhere along the way I decided that meant deciding who mattered and who didn't. That wasn't my call to make. It was never my call to make. Tom studied him for a long moment. There was a version of this moment where he could have let the room's shock curdle into full public humiliation for Randall, could have let the weight of the general's revelation crush the man who'd spent the whole night making jokes at his expense. Some part of him, the tired, hurt part, wanted exactly that. But he thought of Lily, and what he'd want her to see if she were standing here. He thought about what kind of man he wanted to be on the other side of this reveal, not just what kind of soldier he'd been on the other side of an old deployment. I'm not interested in humiliating anyone, Randall, Tom said finally. I spent a long time not wanting to be defined by what happened in Kandahar. I'm not going to turn around now and let this moment define you either. What I want is a lot simpler than an apology. What's that? Randall asked. I want you to remember what tonight felt like, Tom said, the next time you decide someone in a flannel shirt doesn't have a story worth knowing. Randall nodded slowly, something in his face suggesting the lesson had actually landed, not just in a performative, party-appropriate way, but somewhere deeper. Later that night, after most of the shock had settled into quiet conversation and the band had started playing again, though more subdued now, Tom found himself sitting with Ellis Boone near the edge of the room, much the way he had at the start of the evening, except everything about how the room regarded him had changed. You could have told everyone the whole story at once, Ellis said. Made a bigger show of it. Didn't want to, Tom said. That's not really who I am. Never was. You listened to me tonight before any of this happened, Ellis said. Before anyone knew you were, whatever you are. Colonel. Hero. Whatever word fits. I'm just a dad who used to be a soldier, Tom said. That's the only word that's ever really fit. General Whitfield approached them a while later, 2 drinks in hand, offering one to Tom. There's a ceremony, Whitfield said. Overdue by about 8 years. The base wants to properly honor what happened at Kandahar Ridge. I know you turned it down before. I'm asking you to reconsider. Not for you. For the 41 families who've spent 8 years wanting to say thank you to someone they thought might not even be alive. Tom was quiet for a long moment, turning the glass in his hand. My daughter's never really known this part of me, he said finally. I kept it from her, not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't want her growing up in the shadow of a story bigger than our actual life together. She doesn't have to live in its shadow, Whitfield said. She could just know her father is someone worth being proud of. Those aren't the same thing. Tom nodded slowly. Maybe it's time she understood that. Before the general left that night, he pulled Randall Cobb aside, quietly, without an audience. Nobody heard exactly what was said between them, but Randall emerged from the conversation looking like a man who'd been given both a serious talking to and, somehow, a chance to make it right. He spent the rest of the evening quietly making the rounds, personally apologizing not just to Tom but to Ellis, to a few other men he'd spent years overlooking or belittling in smaller ways that had accumulated over 2 decades of these reunions. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a complete transformation. But it was a start, and Tom recognized the difference between a man who was performing contrition and a man who had genuinely been shaken into reconsidering who he'd become. Randall, to his credit, seemed to be the latter. 3 weeks later, Tom stood at a small ceremony at the base an hour from Ashford Falls, Lily beside him in a new dress she'd insisted on picking out herself, her hand tucked into his. General Whitfield spoke briefly about Kandahar Ridge, about the extraction, about 41 men who came home because one colonel refused to leave anyone behind, even at the cost of his own safety. Tom didn't say much when it was his turn. He kept it short, the way he kept most things. "I didn't do what I did to be remembered," he said, looking out at a small crowd that included several of the men from the reunion, Ellis Boone among them, and even Randall Cobb standing quietly near the back. "I did it because those men were mine to bring home, and I wasn't going to leave any of them behind. If people want to call that heroism, I won't argue with them anymore. But I think the real measure of a person isn't found on a battlefield. It's found in the ordinary moments after, in how you treat the people nobody else bothers to notice." He looked down at Lily, who was watching him with an expression somewhere between awe and simple, uncomplicated love, the kind that had nothing to do with medals or rank. "That's the only kind of hero I ever wanted to be for her," he said. "The kind who shows up. The kind who listens. The kind who doesn't need a room full of applause to know he did right by the people who needed him." After the ceremony, as the crowd slowly dispersed, Ellis Boone approached him one more time. "I've been thinking," Ellis said, "about starting something. A support group, maybe, for guys like me who came home and never quite figured out how to take up space in a room again. I don't really know where to start." Tom smiled, the first easy, unguarded smile he'd worn in the whole story. "I know where to start," he said. "You start by finding one person willing to listen to the whole story. Then you go from there." He clasped Ellis's shoulder, the same way General Whitfield had clasped his weeks earlier, and something about the gesture felt like it closed a circle that had been open for a very long time. Lily tugged on his sleeve as they walked back to the car, the late afternoon sun catching the small, worn photograph she'd found tucked in his jacket pocket, the one that had traveled with him through every quiet, humble year since Kandahar. "Dad," she said, "were you scared? Back then?" Tom thought about it for a long moment before answering, the way he thought about most things that mattered. "Every single day," he said. "But I learned something important out there, kiddo. Being scared doesn't mean you stop showing up for people. Sometimes showing up scared is the whole point." She seemed satisfied with that answer, the way children often are with truths simpler than the ones adults tend to complicate. They drove home together as the sun began to set over Ashford Falls, past the hardware store where Tom would show up again Monday morning in his same worn flannel shirt, past the school where he'd pick her up every afternoon like always, back to the small, ordinary life he'd built out of the wreckage of an extraordinary one. Because in the end, that was the real story, not the ridge, not the medals, not the men in pressed blazers who'd finally learned to see him. It was the quiet, deliberate choice, made every single day, to be an ordinary man doing extraordinary things for the one person who mattered most. Some heroes wear medals. Others just wear the same flannel shirt to school pickup, year after year, and never once asked to be seen until the moment the truth finally speaks for itself.